wind had turned bitter in St. Sed's on the Moor, rattling the casement windows of Ashworth Hall as though some invisible hand insisted on entry. Inside, the great house was warm with lamplight and chatter. The Colonel's autumn dinner party was the talk of the village, not merely because Colonel Reginald Ashworth rarely entertained, but because he had invited, among the usual local notables, a stranger from London. Mr. Leonard Copley, a tall, watchful man with ink stains on his cuffs and an air of measuring everyone in the room. Miss Marple, seated discreetly near the fire, noted everything, the way Mrs. Frobisher's pearls clicked against her glass when she laughed too hard, how young Emily Ashworth fidgeted when her father spoke, how the Colonel's voice grew sharper when discussing the pending sale of a strip of land bordering the railway. She had been invited, she suspected, not out of any deep friendship, but because the Colonel appreciated her reputation for knowing people's business. Dinner proceeded without incident until the moment the Colonel raised his glass in a toast. The crystal gleamed amber under the chandelier, and he drank deep. Miss Marple noticed him pause, just a fraction of a second, his face slackening before he resumed speaking. She dismissed it as fatigue. The Colonel was not a young man. An hour later, as coffee was served in the drawing-room, the sound of shattering porcelain and a heavy thud silenced the conversation. The Colonel lay crumpled beside the escritoire, the coffee cup in shards around him. Dr. Hartridge, who had been among the guests, pushed through the gathering onlookers, knelt, and after a tense moment looked up gravely. "He's gone." The shock was palpable. A few muttered prayers, Emily's stifled sob. Only Miss Marple seemed to register that the Colonel's untouched coffee sat neatly on the tray, far from his body. The police arrived swiftly. Inspector Cray, a solid man with a voice like gravel. He moved the guests into the music room while Sergeant Bell examined the body. Poison was suspected almost immediately. The Colonel's lips were faintly blue, and there was a smell, bitter like almonds, clinging to his breath. The decanter of brandy from which his toast had been poured was tested. Nothing. The wine likewise, the coffee, still in the pot and cups, was clean. That left the chalice-shaped glass in which the Colonel had drunk his toast. It was locked in the sideboard now, under the inspector's orders, but here was the first problem. The glass was spotless. Not just rinsed, polished to a gleam, no trace of residue. Yet Miss Marple, who had been watching throughout, was certain no one had taken it from the Colonel's hand until after he collapsed. An odd clue emerged from the carpet beneath where the Colonel had fallen, a tiny brass button, no larger than a pea, engraved with the image of a rearing horse. It did not match any uniform or garment in the house, and no guest claimed it. It was, on the surface, absurdly irrelevant, yet Inspector Cray had it placed in an evidence envelope, as if it were the crown jewel. The house was locked from the inside. The footman swore all doors were bolted after the last guest arrived, and the windows were latched. No stranger could have entered, and no guest had left. Every servant accounted for their whereabouts. A crime in such a sealed setting ought to have been straightforward, but the method, opportunity, and motive refused to align. By midnight, Cray was pacing. No poison in the bottles, none in the coffee, glass scrubbed clean. If someone slipped it in, how, and why polish the glass in full view? Miss Marple's mind ticked over. She had seen something, small, seemingly meaningless, while the Colonel drank his toast. It was not the glass that caught her attention, but the moment Mr. Copley leaned to murmur something to Emily, his hand resting lightly on the table, his cuff brushing the rim of the Colonel's plate. It was fleeting, and at the time she thought it only a Londoner's easy familiarity. The guests were released to their rooms, the servants dismissed to their quarters, under strict instructions not to leave. The Colonel's study was sealed, his papers, including the railway sale contract, locked in the safe. The brass button sat on the inspector's desk like a puzzle piece from the wrong box. In her room, Miss Marple sat in her dressing gown, knitting untouched in her lap, replaying the dinner in her mind. The button, the polished glass, the way the Colonel had seemed momentarily unsteady right after his toast, but had not collapsed until an hour later. Slow-acting poison, perhaps, but then why the elaborate cleaning of the glass? It was as if the killer wanted them to think the method had been in the drink, when in truth the answer lay somewhere else entirely. And there was another thing. the peculiar absence of one guest's outer coat in the hall, though she distinctly remembered its hanging there when she first arrived. A coat could hide many things, she thought, and perhaps even the origin of a brass button. Downstairs, in the dim lamplight, the inspector was staring at the evidence list. "Either it's the simplest murder I've ever seen, or the cleverest," he muttered. Miss Marple suspected it was the latter, and somewhere in this locked house the truth sat waiting, hidden in plain sight. The following morning dawned grey and raw, the mist lying low over the moor as if reluctant to lift and reveal the events of the night before. The air in Ashworth Hall felt heavy, every creak of the old timbers echoing unnaturally in the hush. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Most of the guests picked listlessly at their food, their eyes flicking to the empty chair at the head of the table. Inspector Cray, still in yesterday's suit, sat at the far end, sipping tea with a scowl that suggested no progress had been made overnight. Miss Marple, neat in her pale blue cardigan, observed them all without appearing to. She noticed how Emily Ashworth avoided looking at Mr. Copley, though she answered him when he spoke. She noted that Mrs. Frobisher's voice was unusually shrill when she speculated aloud about the poison, her hands trembling slightly as she buttered her toast. The servants moved with subdued haste, yet Miss Marple could tell they had been instructed to watch the guests as much as serve them. Inspector Cray began asking each guest to remain in the library after breakfast for a second round of questioning. He moved in his steady, methodical way, writing notes in a thick ledger. His questions were practical: times, movements, what each person had eaten or drunk. They were the sort of questions designed to fit neatly into forms, but they left much unsaid. When it was Miss Marple's turn, she answered politely, even blandly, giving the appearance of a woman with nothing to add. But she had already made her own quiet survey of the scene that morning before the rest of the house stirred. In the dining room she had found a small discrepancy. The Colonel's chair had been moved slightly from where it had been during dinner, just enough to alter the sight line to the decanter on the sideboard. To most, it would be meaningless. To her, it suggested someone had been thinking carefully about position and access. She had also noticed the absence of a particular silver salt cellar from the table set in the breakfast room. It was a heavy little thing shaped like a crown, and she remembered it clearly from the night before because the Colonel had made a passing remark about it being a wedding gift. Now it was gone. No servant could account for its absence. Such a trifle could hardly be connected to the murder, unless it had been a vehicle for delivering something unpleasant. When Mr. Copley entered the library for his turn with the inspector, Miss Marple remained near the door, feigning interest in a botanical print. She could see his posture, the way his long fingers worried the edge of the chair's arm. He answered the inspector's questions with smooth ease, but at the mention of the brass button, his gaze flickered, just a fraction of a second toward the sideboard where the glass had been stored. It was so quick, so controlled, that Cray missed it entirely. Outside in the hallway, Miss Marple nearly collided with the butler, a solemn man named Yates. He was carrying a tray covered with a cloth. She glanced at it idly and said, "Such a pity about the Colonel's study being locked up. He had so many interesting knickknacks." Yates hesitated, then nodded gravely. "Yes, madam, though I suppose the inspector must keep things as they are." There was a slight bulge under the cloth, oddly shaped, as if something rigid and metallic lay beneath. Yates inclined his head and moved on, but not before she saw a corner of polished silver peeking from under the fabric, the missing salt cellar. She filed that away without comment. The butler might be an unwitting carrier of evidence, or he might be more involved. In either case, to draw attention now would only cause the object to disappear again. By mid-morning, the inspector had finished his second round and was poring over his notes, muttering about the impossibility of the thing. "Every blasted clue points nowhere," he grumbled. "No traces of poison, no chance for anyone to get at his drink without being seen. And what's that button doing in the middle of the floor?" Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "Buttons are curious things, Inspector. They tend to come away in moments of, shall we say, haste or struggle. I've known a good many cases where a single button told more of the story than a dozen witnesses." Cray looked unconvinced, but humoured her. "Well, if you've any bright ideas about where it came from, I'm all ears." Later, As the guests milled in the drawing-room under the thin excuse of morning coffee, Miss Marple placed herself beside the hearth where she could see both the doorway and the large gilt mirror that reflected a portion of the hall. She watched as Mr. Copley excused himself and stepped quietly into the passage, glancing over his shoulder before disappearing toward the service corridor. A moment later, Yates emerged from the same direction, empty-handed now, his step brisk and his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple turned back to her knitting, letting her needles click softly while she considered the arrangement of events. Someone had polished that glass after the Colonel's toast, not in secret, but brazenly enough to make it seem part of the usual clearing away. Yet the poison had taken effect much later. That suggested either a slow-working toxin or a delivery method that was not the drink at all. The missing salt cellar, the moved chair, the peculiar interest in the brass button, they were like stitches in a pattern she had not yet fully seen. What she had seen, however, was enough to convince her that at least one person in the house was playing a careful game of misdirection. And if she was not mistaken, they had just made a small but critical mistake, returning to the scene of their own handiwork, unaware that an old lady with a keen eye was quietly taking note of every move. Inspector Cray decided the only way forward was to interview the household once again, this time with sharper questions and a watch for the subtle tells. People could not hide forever. The guests and servants were gathered in the library, seated in stiff-backed chairs beneath the Colonel's grim oil portrait. Miss Marple, ostensibly there as a witness herself, was quietly granted permission to remain for all the questioning. Cray thought her a harmless old dear. She thought him a decent policeman with just enough sense to let her listen. The first to be called forward was Emily Ashworth. She looked pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She described the dinner as she had before, the toast, the meal, the conversation about the railway land, her brief exchange with Mr. Copley. Cray pressed her. Had she noticed anyone near the brandy decanter besides her father? Emily hesitated, just enough to make Miss Marple's ears prick. "No, Inspector, I don't believe so." But her voice rose slightly at the end, and she glanced toward Mr. Copley in the corner. A small thing, but enough to plant a seed of doubt. Mrs. Frobisher went next, swathed in a mauve shawl, her pearls glinting under the lamplight. She leaned forward eagerly, answering every question with the brisk confidence of one who enjoys being part of a mystery, too eagerly, in fact. "I distinctly recall," she said, "that Mr. Copley poured his own wine and the Colonel's brandy. Quite gallant of him." It was the first time anyone had said so outright. Cray frowned. "Strange you didn't mention that last night." Mrs. Frobisher waved a hand. One can hardly recall everything when one's host has just dropped dead at one's feet. Her eagerness had a brittle edge to it, Miss Marple thought. She had the manner of a woman who wanted to appear helpful while steering attention in a certain direction. Whether she meant to protect someone or divert suspicion entirely remained to be seen. Yates the butler was next. He stood ramrod straight, voice steady, recounting the serving of each course, the clearing of plates, the refilling of glasses. When asked about the salt cellar, his brow furrowed. "It was present during dinner, sir, but I cannot say where it is now. Perhaps one of the under-footmen misplaced it while clearing." Miss Marple, watching him closely, noticed the tiniest flicker of his eyes toward the service corridor before he answered. Not guilt, necessarily, but knowledge. Mr. Copley's turn came. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, speaking in a measured tone. He confirmed his conversation with Emily, denied pouring the Colonel's brandy, and claimed to have been discussing art with Mrs. Frobisher at the time of the toast. Mrs. Frobisher, still seated at the edge of the circle, nodded too quickly. That nod, Miss Marple thought, was the kind people use when they've rehearsed an answer. Inspector Cray moved on to the footman, James. The young man was nervous, tugging at his cuffs. "I brought in the coffee," he said, set the tray down, and left straight away. Didn't see nothing else. Yet Miss Marple remembered clearly that James had lingered near the door while the Colonel poured his coffee. When she asked gently, "And you didn't notice anyone handling the Colonel's glass, dear?" He blushed. "Well, I did see Mrs. Frobisher move it to make room for the port, but that was all." Cray's pencil paused. "You're certain of that?" James nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir." Piece by piece, contradictions began to stack like uneven cards. Mrs. Frobisher had said Copley poured the brandy, but Copley denied it and claimed to be with her at the time. Emily claimed no one approached the decanter, but James saw Mrs. Frobisher shift the Colonel's glass. Yates admitted the salt cellar had been present, but now claimed ignorance of its disappearance, though Miss Marple had seen it in his possession under that tray. The final to be questioned was Mrs. Ashworth's lady's maid, Clara. A quiet, mousy woman, she seemed reluctant to speak at all. When pressed, she admitted she had passed through the dining room just before dessert to fetch a shawl for her mistress. "I didn't touch anything," she insisted, but in saying so, she betrayed knowledge that the inspector had not mentioned, that the Colonel's chair had been moved slightly. "It was in my way," she said quickly when asked how she knew. "I thought perhaps the servants had bumped it." When the questioning concluded, the guests drifted away in uneasy silence. Cray rubbed his temples. They can't all be telling the truth. Half of them saw things the others swear never happened. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "That is often the way with witnesses, Inspector. They embroider what they've seen, or leave things out, because the truth, when it brushes too close, makes them uncomfortable." He grunted. "And what do you make of it?" "I make of it," she said gently, "that at least two people here are lying, but not for the same reason. One lies to protect themselves, the other to protect someone else, and both, I suspect, are watching that brass button more closely than you are." As she left the library, Miss Marple's eyes drifted once more to the hall stand where the coats and cloaks hung. The missing coat from the night before had reappeared, Mr. Copley's tweed, if she was not mistaken. A careful eye might notice the faint strain at one of the front seams, as though a button had been ripped away. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in the drawing-room, her knitting in her lap, though her hands rarely moved. The low murmur of conversation between guests floated through the air, each word a thread she could tug on later. She had learned over many years that people, when they thought themselves unobserved, revealed far more in idle chatter than they did under direct questioning. The situation was no longer simply a matter of who had poisoned Colonel Ashworth. It was a knot of tangled motives that seemed to bind everyone in the house, yet no single rope led directly to the crime. Emily Ashworth was the most obvious figure to consider. She had grown up under her father's stern control, and more than one villager had whispered about quarrels over her wish to marry someone he disapproved of. The Colonel's death would free her from that control and, by inheritance, place her in possession of Ashworth Hall and the surrounding lands. Yet Emily's grief appeared genuine, and Miss Marple suspected that a young woman's desire for freedom was rarely so calculating as to drive her to murder, though desperation could be another matter. Mr. Copley's presence at the dinner was harder to explain. Ostensibly he was a distant acquaintance from London, but he had taken a keen interest in the Colonel's sale of land to the railway. As a solicitor, he might have been advising a buyer, or protecting the interests of a seller who wished to drive the price down. The Colonel had been known to change his mind abruptly about business dealings. Perhaps Copley feared he was about to withdraw from an agreement. Such fears had a way of pushing otherwise respectable men toward drastic action. Mrs. Frobisher, for all her genteel airs, had debts that were common knowledge in the village. She had invested foolishly and lived on the edge of financial collapse. The Colonel, who disliked such improvidence, had refused her request for a loan only a month ago. If he died without altering his will, she would inherit a small sum through a distant family connection, enough, perhaps, to stave off ruin. Her eagerness to be helpful in the investigation now could easily be the overcompensation of a guilty conscience. Then there was Yates, the butler, discreet, proper, and with decades of service behind him. Miss Marple had never yet met a household where the butler did not know far more than he said, and this one had handled the missing salt cellar with suspicious care. It was possible he had stumbled upon the murder method by accident and concealed the evidence to protect the household's reputation. It was also possible he had a more personal reason. The Colonel's will, lodged at the local solicitor's office, contained a modest bequest to Yates, which might be lost if the Colonel altered it, and Miss Marple could not overlook that flicker in his eyes when the inspector mentioned the salt cellar. The footman, James, seemed the least likely culprit at first glance, young, awkward, and nervous, but his testimony had shifted between the first and second rounds of questioning. He had also been the only servant with an unobstructed view of the table when the toast was made. People in such positions could be persuaded, or paid, to act as someone else's hand. Clara, the maid, was even quieter, but her knowledge of the moved chair suggested she had been more attentive to the table setting than she admitted. Servants often noticed things their betters did not, but they also knew the value of silence, especially if that silence could be traded for protection or money. Miss Marple sorted these threads in her mind, testing each motive against the others. Greed explained Mrs. Frobisher, perhaps James. Fear of exposure, of losing a business deal, could belong to Copley. Revenge, or at least resentment, might suit Emily. Yates could have acted from loyalty twisted into something darker, or from self-preservation. Yet none of these alone explained the button, the salt cellar, and the timing of the poison. In the late afternoon, she took a quiet stroll through the garden. The air was damp and cool, the last roses bowing under their own weight. It was here she encountered Inspector Cray, who was lighting a cigarette under the shelter of a stone archway. "You've been thinking," he said, eyeing her with mild suspicion. "One does, Inspector, when one has time and a mind for patterns," Miss Marple replied. "Find any that fit?" She considered. "Not yet. It's a curious case, because the motives do not point toward a single hand, but rather suggest that several people might have been glad of the Colonel's death, though their gladness might stem from entirely different causes. It creates what I call a motive maze. One enters from many paths, but there is only one exit. The trick is to find which path the murderer took." Cray exhaled a stream of smoke. "If we could prove who had the opportunity, that'd be half the battle." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but opportunity is like a key. It can be handed from one person to another without anyone noticing. What I wonder, Inspector, is whether someone here lent their key, so to speak, to another, wittingly or unwittingly." They returned indoors as the mist thickened. In the hall she noticed the guests had gathered again, Emily standing apart near the window, Copley by the fireplace, Mrs. Frobisher fussing with her shawl, Yates and James discreetly at the edges. Each was watching the others as though expecting the next move in a game. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting once more, and let her eyes drift between them. She imagined invisible threads connecting each to the Colonel's death, debts pulling toward greed, quarrels drawing lines of resentment, secret agreements binding them in ways they could not admit. Somewhere among those tangled strands was the truth, a truth that would, when pulled, unravel the whole design. The following morning brought a sudden stir of excitement to Ashworth Hall. Word spread quickly among the guests and staff that Inspector Cray had got his man. The police, it seemed, had discovered a decisive link. The brass button found beneath the Colonel's body matched the missing button from Mr. Copley's tweed coat. The match was undeniable. When the inspector presented the coat in the library, the tear in the seam where the button had once been was clear. The fabric strained as if it had been ripped away suddenly. Copley, summoned to account for it, explained with a calmness that verged on disdain. "I must have lost it yesterday, Inspector. Coats do shed buttons now and then." "Under a dead man, Mr. Copley," Cray shot back. "That's a rather particular place to lose one." The theory was hastily sketched out. Copley, eager to secure the Colonel's agreement to the railway sale, feared the older man would back out. In the course of an argument during the dinner, perhaps. After the toast, Copley had brushed close enough to administer the poison, his cuff grazing the Colonel's glass. At some point, there had been a brief physical exchange or stumble, during which the button tore away, falling unnoticed to the carpet. It sounded neat. Too neat. Copley was detained in the study under guard, while Cray began drafting the paperwork to take him into custody in Exeter. Guests whispered in the corridors. Mrs. Frobisher wore an expression of smug vindication, as though her earlier observation of Copley pouring the Colonel's brandy had been proven right. Emily, pale but composed, avoided speaking to anyone, her eyes fixed on some private thought. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was sitting in the small morning-room, her knitting idle on her lap. She had been allowed to inspect the coat and button herself. Cray, in his moment of triumph, had no reason to refuse. The stitching around the missing button was frayed. Yes, but in a manner that suggested it had not been pulled away in a sudden violent moment. Rather, it looked as though it had been cut, carefully, with a small blade, the ends of the thread clean and deliberate. If the button had been placed deliberately beneath the Colonel's body, it was a plant, not a trace of struggle. Which meant that someone wanted Copley to take the blame. She also thought of the timing. The Colonel had taken the toast before dinner. Yet he had not collapsed until much later after the coffee was served. If the poison had been introduced at the toast, it would have had to be extraordinarily slow-acting, but the medical man's initial examination suggested the symptoms appeared too abruptly for such a delay. This discrepancy nagged at her, an untidy seam in the inspector's tidy theory. Cray, however, was jubilant. By mid-afternoon he had assembled the guests in the drawing-room to announce that the case was solved. "We have the button, we have motive, and we have opportunity," he declared. "Mr. Copley will be formally charged. I thank you all for your cooperation." A ripple of relief moved through the room, though it was tinged with unease. Copley, standing stiffly between two constables, looked neither surprised nor cowed. "This is a mistake, Inspector," he said evenly, "and when it's proven so, I will expect a full apology." Miss Marple's gaze drifted around the room, noting the reactions. Emily's shoulders eased slightly, too slightly. Mrs. Frobisher's eyes darted almost involuntarily toward the service door. Yates, the butler, maintained his perfect composure, but his left hand twitched once against the seam of his trousers, and James the footman avoided looking at Copley entirely. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the hearth, speaking quietly to Cray. "It's a satisfying conclusion, Inspector," she said mildly, "but doesn't it trouble you just a little that the button could have been cut away?" Cray frowned. "Cut away? I didn't see any sign of that." "Ah," she said, "perhaps my old eyes deceive me, but I should think a man like Mr. Copley, who dresses with such care, would notice a button missing at once. And if he had noticed, would he have worn the coat again this morning, inviting the very discovery you've made?" Cray's brows drew together, but before he could respond, a constable entered to report that the missing silver salt cellar had been found in the coal scuttle beside the servants' hall. It was badly tarnished, as though it had been handled with something corrosive. The inspector seized on it at once as further proof of Copley's guilt, but Miss Marple's thoughts went another way entirely. If the salt cellar had been used to administer the poison, hiding it in the coal was not the act of a man under immediate suspicion. It was the act of someone confident that suspicion lay elsewhere. That night the house was restless. Doors opened and shut softly, floorboards creaked under cautious feet. The guests pretended to retire early, but Miss Marple sat up in her room with the light low, listening. She heard the faint tread of someone moving past her door toward the service wing, then returning minutes later. She smiled to herself in the dimness. The real murderer was still here, still moving pieces on the board, confident that the false victory of Copley's arrest had brought them safety. But the game was not yet over, and she meant to see it through to the end. The morning after Copley's supposed unmasking, Ashworth Hall seemed oddly lighter, as if the fog had lifted both outside and in. The guests moved with more ease, and even Inspector Cray allowed himself the luxury of a second cup of coffee. Yet Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the breakfast room, knew the air of relief was false. She could feel it in the way eyes still flicked sideways when certain names were mentioned, in the way conversation stopped abruptly when someone unexpected entered the room. Her own thoughts circled back to the tarnished silver salt cellar. It had been hidden in the coal scuttle, an oddly desperate choice if the culprit had days or even hours to find a better place. And then there was the fact that the cellar had been shaped like a crown. In the light of morning, that shape tugged at a memory, something from years before, a brief mention in a village newsletter about a theft at a manor house 3 counties over. Miss Marple excused herself after breakfast and wandered into the library, ostensibly to look for a gardening book. Instead, she found the Colonel's locked desk still under police seal, but the shelves nearby were open, and among them she spotted a slim volume of local history. Leafing through it, she came across a photograph from the 1920s, a group of young men in military dress standing before a regimental banner. There, unmistakably, was a younger Colonel Ashworth, shoulders squared, moustache precise, beside another officer, whose eyes were sharp and calculating. The caption named him as Lieutenant Henry Frobisher, Mrs. Frobisher's late husband. It struck Miss Marple that neither Mrs. Frobisher nor the Colonel had ever spoken of their connection before. She doubted that was an accident, and now, thinking back to conversations from the night of the murder, she remembered the slight edge in the Colonel's tone when addressing her. There was history there, something unspoken. That same morning, Yates passed through the library carrying correspondence. Miss Marple, with a gentle, almost absent smile, said, "I suppose the Colonel must have kept in touch with his old comrades. Did he ever speak of Lieutenant Frobisher? The butler's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Rarely, madam," he said after a pause. "They served together in India, but I believe there was an incident." His voice was careful, but the faint tightening around his mouth told her it was something more than an incident. Later, when the inspector had gone out to the stables to speak with the constable, Miss Marple found Emily in the morning room, staring absently out at the lawn. "It's difficult, isn't it, my dear?" she began gently, "when family acquaintances are not quite what they seem." Emily turned, frowning slightly. "Do you mean Mrs. Frobisher?" Miss Marple nodded. "Your father and her husband had some history, shall we say? One might wonder whether it was entirely cordial." Emily hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I overheard my father once, years ago, speaking with Mother about it. He said Frobisher had done something disgraceful during the war, something that nearly cost men their lives. But instead of being court-martialed, he resigned his commission quietly. My father always believed he'd been protected by someone with influence. He never forgave him." A quarrel from decades past, thought Miss Marple, could still cast a long shadow. And if Mrs. Frobisher had lived with that quiet disgrace hanging over her name, she might have seen the Colonel's death as the closing of an old wound, or the prevention of an old scandal from resurfacing. The memory of that theft returned to her again. The stolen items had included several small silver pieces, one of which was described as a crown-shaped salt cellar. At the time, no culprit had been found. Could the Colonel have acquired it later, innocently or otherwise, or had it been taken from the Frobishers and passed into his possession by means better left unexamined? As the day wore on, Miss Marple began to trace a web of quiet connections. The theft years ago, the bitter army past, the Colonel's stubborn refusal to aid Mrs. Frobisher financially. Then there was Yates. He had been in the Colonel's service since before Emily was born, but also had worked briefly for the Frobishers in the late 1920s, something Miss Marple had read in an old parish register during a visit years ago. That small fact, overlooked by most, now hummed with significance. When she next crossed paths with Yates, she asked, "It must have been a strange thing to serve both the Colonel and Mrs. Frobisher's household in your time." His face was a mask, but his voice was quiet. "One does one's duty, madam, wherever one is placed." The words were neutral, but the air behind them was not. That night, as the wind hissed around the chimneys, Miss Marple lay awake turning over the connections. If the salt cellar had indeed been part of the old theft, and if Yates had known its origin, then its sudden disappearance and reappearance in the coal scuttle might be more than concealment of a murder weapon. It could be the erasure of a link between the murder and a scandal from the past. And yet, she thought, someone else in the house must have remembered that scandal too. Someone who had reason to fear the Colonel might speak of it, perhaps to ruin them, perhaps to leverage them. It was no longer just about the poisoned chalice on a chill autumn night. This was about old grudges, hidden shame, and a silver crown that had travelled through more hands than anyone dared admit. The past had crept into the present, and in its shadow, the real killer was still moving unseen. The next morning, Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, long before Inspector Cray or the household had begun their day. She had decided that the time had come for a small, carefully engineered experiment, one that would not only draw out hidden truths, but might also unsettle the careful masks each suspect had been wearing. It was an idea born from years of observing human nature in village parlours and church fêtes, where the smallest prod, a remark about the vicar's sermon, or an innocent query about a missing teacup, could cause ripples that revealed far more than intended. Here, the matter was far darker, but the principle would be the same. She began by asking Yates for a favour. "I wonder," she said sweetly, "whether you might be so good as to fetch a few of the Colonel's personal items from his study. I believe the inspector will want to see them later." Among the things she requested was the silver salt cellar, the very one recovered from the coal scuttle. Yates hesitated, then nodded stiffly. When he returned, Miss Marple took the salt cellar in her hand and examined it in the morning light. The tarnish was heavy, but the crown motif was still clear. With a quiet hum, she polished it ever so slightly with the edge of her handkerchief before placing it in the centre of a low table in the drawing-room. Then she waited. Her plan was simple. The object would not be announced, but its sudden and prominent placement, after days in police custody, would catch certain eyes and betray certain minds. Anyone who recognized it, feared it, or had a reason to avoid it would show something, however fleeting. The household began to drift into the drawing room over the course of the morning. Mrs. Frobisher arrived first, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her gaze swept the room, and then, quite unconsciously, dipped to the salt cellar. The smile vanished for a fraction of a second before she turned toward Miss Marple, commenting airily about the weather. Emily came next, her face pale from a restless night. She barely glanced at the object, though her hands tightened on the back of a chair, suggesting she was aware of its presence without wanting to look too closely. It was Yates's entrance, however, that most interested Miss Marple. The butler stopped short in the doorway, his expression perfectly neutral. Too neutral. His eyes flicked to the table, then away, with the careful control of a man who knew that staring would be as dangerous as snatching it up and hiding it. He busied himself with arranging flowers that needed no arranging, the stems snapping under a little too much force. But the real surprise came when Inspector Cray entered. He gave the salt cellar a puzzled look. "I thought we'd sent that back to the evidence room," he said sharply. "Oh, perhaps you did," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but I thought it might be of interest to have it here for the moment. It's curious how objects can stir the mind, don't you think?" It was then that Harold Pierce, the Colonel's neighbour, and one of the more peripheral figures in the investigation, arrived. Until now, he had seemed barely involved, helpful enough when asked questions, but otherwise absent. His reaction was instant and visceral. His eyes widened, and he muttered something under his breath before catching himself. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "A handsome piece, is it not, Mr. Pierce?" she said softly. He hesitated. Yes, I suppose so. Looks old." He turned away too quickly, moving to stand by the fireplace. Later, when the room had cleared, Inspector Cray crossed his arms. "All right, Miss Marple. What was that performance for?" She gave him her mildest look. "My dear Inspector, people reveal the most interesting truths when they believe no one is watching. Mrs. Frobisher recognized the salt cellar, though she pretended otherwise. Yates fears it deeply, but has the discipline to mask it. And Mr. Pierce, well, I dare say he's seen it before under circumstances he would rather not mention." Cray frowned. "Pierce? He's hardly connected to the family." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said gently. "He served in the same regiment as the Colonel and Lieutenant Frobisher. I remembered seeing his name in that regimental photograph in the library, standing 3 men down from the Colonel himself. I believe the 3 of them knew each other far better than they admit, and if the salt cellar was taken in that theft all those years ago—" She let the sentence trail off. The inspector's brows knit together. "So, you're saying this isn't just a family squabble. It's something older? Military? Maybe even criminal?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "And if it is, then the motive for the Colonel's death may not be greed or jealousy alone. It might be fear, the fear of an old crime finally being spoken aloud." That afternoon she pressed her advantage. She took the salt cellar to the terrace under the pretence of admiring its craftsmanship in the sunlight, where she knew several of the suspects would pass. As each did, she struck up some idle remark about family heirlooms, about how such things travelled through time, sometimes in the strangest ways. It was during one such conversation with Mr. Pierce that the real crack appeared. She mentioned offhandedly that the piece must have been quite the talking point in the officers' mess. His head jerked up, and a flush spread across his neck. "What do you mean by that?" he demanded. "Oh, nothing," she said mildly. "Only that it is such an unusual design. Surely it would have been noticed, especially if it were not meant to be there." His mouth opened, then closed. He muttered something about old stories, and excused himself abruptly. It was a small slip, but it was enough. Miss Marple, watching him go, felt the faint click of a puzzle piece sliding into place. Pierce had just confirmed more than he realized. He knew the salt cellar's history, and that knowledge tied him directly to whatever shadowy matter the Colonel had been keeping silent about. The tactic had worked. The salt cellar, harmless in appearance, had proved the perfect bait. And now the circle of those who truly understood its significance had narrowed to a precious few, each one tangled in the web of an old, dangerous secret that was drawing tighter by the hour. By the following morning, the salt cellar had vanished. Miss Marple noticed it first, not because she had intended to examine it again, but because its absence was like a missing tooth in the neat arrangement of the drawing-room. The low table where it had rested was bare except for a faint circular outline in the dust. She stood for a moment, her knitting bag dangling loosely in one hand, letting the silence of the room speak to her. It had not been moved for safekeeping. She knew the inspector had no reason to do so without telling her, nor had it been quietly returned to the police station. No, this was deliberate. By the time Inspector Cray arrived, her suspicions were confirmed. "It's gone?" he demanded when she told him. "Blast it. We had the thing tagged and logged. I'll search every room." "That will do little good," Miss Marple said mildly. "It is not misplaced. It has been removed with care and purpose." She tilted her head, her voice thoughtful. "Someone understands what it means now, and they are frightened enough to risk everything to make it disappear." Cray began pacing. We were making progress. That piece tied Pierce to the Colonel's past, and possibly Mrs. Frobisher and Yates too. Whoever took it knew we were getting close. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though the steel in her voice was clear. "My dear Inspector, what you call progress, others call danger. A cornered mind will do desperate things." The investigation shifted at once from uncovering old secrets to chasing a present, immediate crime. The salt cellar had been last seen late the previous evening, after Miss Marple's terrace conversation with Pierce. Yates had brought in tea to the drawing-room after that, but claimed he hadn't noticed anything unusual. Mrs. Frobisher said she had gone straight to bed. Emily insisted she had been in her room reading. Pierce himself had left the house after supper, claiming he had a headache and needed air. The problem was that all their stories could be true, or carefully adjusted. Cray ordered the staff questioned again, but Miss Marple noticed the shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer the quiet tension of a household under scrutiny. Now it was the sharp, watching unease of people wondering who among them had crossed the line into active sabotage. Every casual remark was weighed, every glance potentially dangerous. That afternoon, a new clue emerged, not from what was present, but from what was altered. In the library, the regimental photograph she had studied before now hung at a slight angle. She straightened it instinctively and realized that the glass was smudged in one particular corner, as though someone had handled it recently. A closer look revealed that one of the faces, Pierce's, had been slightly scratched, the mark faint but visible in the right light. A warning, or a way to obscure his likeness in case someone came looking? When she mentioned it to Cray, his jaw tightened. Someone's covering their tracks. That's 2 pieces of physical evidence gone, or tampered with in less than a day. "Quite," Miss Marple said softly, "and the first was stolen. The second, defaced. The pattern is clear. They are dismantling the trail before we can follow it." The inspector was about to respond when Yates appeared at the door, his expression unreadable. "Sir, you should know. There's been a break-in at the Colonel's old storage shed. Lock forced. Some items scattered, others missing entirely." The shed, it turned out, was where the Colonel had kept his surplus possessions from his army days, trunks of uniforms, old equipment, and boxes of personal papers. And now, many of those papers were gone. Cray swore under his breath. "They're erasing him," he muttered, "piece by piece." Miss Marple, however, crouched by one of the overturned trunks and examined it carefully. "Not erasing, Inspector. Selectively removing. See here, the books on the lower shelf are untouched, but anything with a regimental seal has been taken. This is not panic. This is method." The thefts were no longer about hiding a single crime. They were part of a larger, calculated effort to ensure that certain connections between the Colonel's past and his death could never be proven, and whoever was behind it was close enough, physically and socially, to act without being noticed until it was too late. By evening, the household was restless. Emily seemed more agitated than usual, pacing in the garden until dusk. Mrs. Frobisher sat stiffly by the fire, claiming a headache but refusing to retire. Pierce had retreated entirely, locking himself in his room. Yates continued his duties with mechanical precision, though his hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, let them think she was absorbed in her stitches. In truth, she was watching, noting who avoided whose gaze, who lingered near which doors, who seemed to listen too closely when others spoke. That night she heard the faint creak of the floorboards in the hall outside her room. She rose silently, moving to the door. In the dim light she saw a figure, slender, hunched slightly forward, slip past carrying something small wrapped in cloth. The figure disappeared toward the servants' staircase. By the time she reached the landing, they were gone. But the smell of coal dust lingered faintly in the air, and Miss Marple knew without doubt the missing salt cellar had not left the house. It was still here, hidden in the very place where this web of deceit had begun, and someone was guarding it as fiercely as their own life. The next move, she realized, would be theirs, and it would not be gentle. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke just after midnight, the wind rattling the shutters and sending a cold dampness through the hallways. Miss Marple lay awake, listening. She had not forgotten the shadowy figure from the night before, nor the lingering scent of coal dust. Whoever had taken the salt cellar was still here, somewhere in the house, and she had a feeling they would not be idle for long. The crash came at 1:14 a.m. It was sharp, metallic, a sound of something falling hard against stone. Miss Marple was on her feet at once, slipping into her dressing gown. From the corridor she could see light spilling from the far end of the landing, the faint murmur of voices rising in panic. When she reached the main staircase, Inspector Cray was already there, his revolver in hand. "Stay back, Miss Marple," he warned, moving toward the open kitchen door. But she did not stay back. Instead, she followed quietly, letting her eyes adjust to the dim flicker of the oil lamp. The scene inside stopped her cold. Yates lay sprawled on the flagstones, his head at an unnatural angle, his eyes fixed open in surprise. The tray he had been carrying was smashed beside him, tea pooling in dark rivulets. "He's dead," Cray said grimly, kneeling beside the body. Neck snapped. This wasn't an accident. The wind moaned through the kitchen's half-open door, and Miss Marple stepped forward, noting the trail of wet footprints leading from the pantry to the back steps. She bent, studying them. The shoes were narrow, the gate light. Too light for Yates himself, too light for Pierce. Someone had been waiting in the kitchen. Yates had either caught them in the act or been silenced for knowing too much. Cray stood, his jaw tight. "This changes everything. We're not just looking for a thief anymore. We've got a killer inside the house." The household was roused in minutes. Pierce arrived first, his face pale but his voice defensive. "I was in my room. I didn't hear a thing until the shouting started." Mrs. Frobisher came next, clutching her robe tight around her as though it were armour, insisting she had been asleep. Emily appeared last, eyes wide, shaking so badly she could barely stand. Miss Marple watched them all closely. Fear was written plainly on their faces, but fear of what? Of the killer among them, or of something being discovered? When the body was removed and the kitchen sealed off, Cray turned to Miss Marple. "This isn't random. Whoever's behind this is playing for time. They want us chasing the wrong threads while they finish whatever they started." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, and if we are not careful, there will be another body before morning." The rest of the night passed in a tense, sleepless vigil. Cray stationed constables at every exit, and Miss Marr. The rain had stopped by mid-morning, leaving the grounds wrapped in a damp, muffled stillness. Constables trudged through the sodden earth, following every possible trail that might lead to Emily, but the woods seemed to swallow tracks as quickly as they were made. Inside the house, tension lay heavy over breakfast, the clinking of cutlery the only sound. Miss Marple, however, was not eating. She sat at the far end of the table, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes moving from face to face as if she were piecing together a tapestry only she could see. It wasn't any single revelation that drew her focus. It was the accumulation of small things, the kind that were easily dismissed in the moment. A habit here, an offhand remark there. The way Mrs. Frobisher never once asked about Emily's well-being, only about whether the back door had been locked. The faint coal smudge on Pierce's cuff that he claimed came from helping in the kitchen, though he was never one to dirty his hands with chores. But what had kept gnawing at her was something Yates had said just 2 days before, when she had asked why he had been in the cellar. "Only fetching the pepper mill, miss. The one with the crack in it. You can't mistake it. At the time, it had seemed a harmless comment. Now, it seemed like a breadcrumb. After breakfast, she excused herself and made her way down to the cellar. The door was stiff with damp, and the air inside smelled of coal and iron. She searched the shelves, sacks of flour, crates of root vegetables, jars of preserves, but no peppermill. She tried the pantry next. Nothing. She was halfway back up the steps when it struck her. A cracked peppermill wasn't valuable in itself, but it could hide something small, something worth killing for. When she returned to the dining room, Cray was leaning over a map with two of his men, marking the search radius. "Inspector," she said, "you still have that box of items from the kitchen, the ones that were moved after Yates's death?" Cray frowned. "Yes, in the study. Why?" "Because I think our killer is fond of hiding in plain sight." Together they went through the box. Pots, cutlery, a tea tin, a broken wine opener, and there, at the bottom, the peppermill. Miss Marple took it gently, turning it over in her hands. The crack was there, as Yates had said. She twisted the top, and it came off too easily. Inside, packed tight, was a small roll of papers bound with twine. Cray's eyebrows rose. "Well, I'll be—" He untied the bundle, revealing a series of receipts, coded notes, and what looked to be shipping manifests. "Smuggling," Miss Marple murmured. "That's what all this is about. Not just theft. Systematic, organized, and tied to someone in this household." Cray scanned the pages. "These documents are weeks old, months even. Whoever killed Yates must have been afraid he'd seen too much, and now Emily's either fled or been taken because she knew too." Miss Marple's thoughts spun faster. There had been an odd rhythm to the events. The cellar, the coal dust, the late-night movements, the specific items that vanished. Each incident was not random, but part of a larger chain. She began listing them aloud, pacing as she spoke. The stolen salt cellar, valuable enough to distract attention. The coal dust in Emily's room, suggesting she had been near the cellar or furnace. The wet footprints, light, quick, belonging to someone nimble. And now the peppermill, an object no one would suspect, carrying records that could ruin the right person if discovered. Cray's jaw tightened. "You're saying this isn't about greed for a single object. It's about keeping the whole operation secret. And," Miss Marple added softly, "someone here has been far too helpful in trying to point suspicion toward others." Her mind returned to last night, when Pierce had been the first to arrive after the commotion in the kitchen. His voice had been sharp, accusing Emily before anyone had mentioned her name. And yet, when she had casually asked him where he kept his raincoat, he had faltered, because it was missing. She had seen it drying in the scullery the next morning, the hem still stained with mud. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a shape, faint but forming. Cray broke her thoughts. If this is a pattern, then the next move is predictable. Whoever's behind this will try to destroy these documents before we can make use of them. Miss Marple's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "Then we must make them think we've hidden them somewhere else entirely, and when they come for them, Inspector, we will be waiting." The plan was set in motion before lunch. Cray spread word, loud enough to be overheard, that the peppermill had been locked in the evidence safe at the station. In truth, the documents were hidden in Miss Marple's knitting basket, which she kept by her chair as though nothing unusual had happened. That afternoon, the household went about its uneasy routine, each person moving like an actor in a play they had not rehearsed. Miss Marple kept her eyes open for the smallest of tells, the too long glance, the unnecessary question, the way someone's hands moved when they thought no one was watching. And then she saw it. Pierce, lingering near the front hall, his fingers brushing the key rack before retreating. Not to take the keys. No, just to feel which ones were there and which were not. Her certainty solidified like frost on glass. The pattern had been there all along, woven through the smallest gestures. Now she only had to let him step fully into the trap. The storm had passed, but another was coming, and this one, Miss Marple knew, would end it. The late afternoon sun slanted through the drawing-room windows, casting long bars of gold across the carpet. Outside, the constables were still combing the grounds, but inside, the air was taut with anticipation. Inspector Cray sat at the writing desk, shuffling through the coded shipping manifests found in the pepper mill. Miss Marple was knitting, calm, unhurried, as if each loop and stitch were another turn of thought in her mind. Pierce, standing near the fireplace, pretended to read the day's paper. His eyes flickered toward the door every few seconds. Cray finally spoke. "We've translated enough of these to get the picture. Contraband shipments, jewels, rare wines, gold, all run through this estate supply deliveries. Whoever was behind this was making a fortune." Pierce gave a short, dismissive laugh. "So? Smuggling isn't exactly murder." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Not unless the person running it thought they were about to be exposed. Pierce's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Cray leaned forward. "We still don't know why Yates had to die, or why Emily vanished. Money explains the smuggling, yes, but it doesn't explain the violence." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, not with amusement, but with the satisfaction of a puzzle's final pieces falling into place. "That's because it was never truly about the money, Inspector. The money was a means, not the end." Cray frowned. Then what was the end? She laid her knitting aside. Legacy, reputation, the preservation of a name. Pierce shifted, his weight moving as though he were ready to bolt. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady, almost gentle. "Pierce, you came here as a butler, but before that you were in service to the Harcourt family in Kent. Their last surviving daughter, your wife, died under circumstances that were, let us say, not entirely clear. There was talk, gossip, and your family name was whispered with hers. I imagine you vowed never again to let anything or anyone tarnish your standing." Cray's gaze sharpened. "Go on." Miss Marple's words were precise now, each one cutting closer to the heart of it. "When you discovered that Yates had stumbled onto the smuggling, quite by accident while repairing a broken cellar door, you saw the danger, not just to your position here, but to the household's respectability. And when Emily saw the pepper mill and recognized her late father's handwriting on the manifests—" Pierce's voice was low, but it cracked under the strain. "She would have told. She was young, impetuous. She didn't understand." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but there was no mercy in them. "You couldn't bear the thought of scandal again, of being turned out, whispered about. In your mind, you were protecting the house, the family name, even if it meant sacrificing those who threatened it." Cray's jaw clenched. "So, you killed Yates, and when Emily found the papers you—" "I didn't kill her," Pierce snapped. "She's alive. I sent her away." The room went very still. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but it reached every corner. "Because deep down you didn't want her blood on your hands. That was your line, wasn't it, Pierce? Theft, deception, even murder once, but only if you could tell yourself it was in service of something noble. But Emily reminded you of your own daughter." Pierce's face twisted, not with rage but with the pain of a truth finally dragged into the light. "She had the same eyes," he whispered. "I couldn't." His voice trailed off. Cray's tone was cold now. "Where is she?" Pierce's shoulders slumped. "A friend in Dover. She's safe. I thought, if I could finish this business, tie it off, she could come back, and no one would be the wiser." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "You see, Inspector, the smuggling was a symptom. The illness was his terror of disgrace. That's why the scheme lasted so long, because it was never purely about greed. It was about building a fortress of control around his life, and striking at anything that threatened to crumble it." Pierce looked at her then, not defiantly, but almost pleadingly. "You think I'm a monster." She met his gaze without flinching. "No, Mr. Pierce. I think you are a man who mistook fear for honor, and fear makes the worst kind of jailer." Cray stepped forward, the handcuffs in his grip glinting in the sunlight. "Pierce Harcourt, you are under arrest for the murder of Thomas Yates, and for your role in an organized smuggling operation. You have the right to remain silent." Pierce didn't resist as the cuffs clicked shut. His eyes went to the window, to the golden light spilling across the lawn, and for the first time he looked older, like a man who had been running from something for far too long, only to find it waiting for him at the end. As Cray led him away, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, the yarn soft between her fingers. She knew the case was not over. Not yet. Emily would have to be found and brought home. The smuggling ring would have other members still in the shadows. But the heart of it, the why, was now laid bare. And as she watched Pierce disappear through the doorway, she thought again of how motives, like people, could wear many masks. Yet in the end, they always showed their true face. The rain had returned to Greystone, sweeping across the moors in wind-driven sheets. From the study's tall windows, Miss Marple could see the gravel drive gleaming under the storm, the lamps casting halos in the downpour. The house was quiet, too quiet for a night when the net was about to close. Inspector Cray stood by the hearth, checking his watch for the third time. "Are you certain this will work? We've only got one shot." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. "If I have learned anything, Inspector, it is that people who build their lives on lies will always return to guard the largest one." On the desk lay the bait, a ledger. Not the original, of course. That had been secured at Scotland Yard. This was a meticulous copy, right down to the ink blots and torn corner on page 17. Inside, every smuggling shipment, every falsified invoice, every coded payment to the mysterious SC was laid bare. Tonight, they would let the remaining figure behind the operation come to claim it. The grandfather clock ticked heavily in the hall. A loose shutter upstairs banged against its frame. Then footsteps, soft, deliberate, crossed the marble floor of the foyer. Cray moved to the side of the doorway, hand on his revolver. Miss Marple remained where she was, the picture of harmless domesticity. The study door eased open, and there she was, Sylvia Carradine, the family's ever-gracious hostess, widow of the late shipping magnate Edward Carradine. Her eyes, cool and sharp, darted to the desk and the ledger upon it. Miss Marple greeted her as if they'd met by chance at a garden tea. "Mrs. Carradine, out rather late, aren't we?" Sylvia's smile was as thin as a blade. "I might say the same of you, Miss Marple, but then I suspect we've both been restless these last few days." She crossed to the desk without asking leave, her hand brushing the ledger's cover. Cray stepped forward. "That's evidence, Mrs. Carradine. Evidence that ties you to the smuggling ring Pierce Harcourt was running. Evidence that says you were the one pulling the strings." Her eyes flicked toward him. "Pierce was a servant, Inspector, a useful one, but hardly a mastermind. He lacked the imagination for an operation of that." Scale Miss Marple's knitting bag sat at her feet. She reached inside, not for yarn, but for a small sheaf of papers. "Your late husband left his affairs in some disorder, did he not? And among them, the rights to a coastal warehouse in Whitby. You kept that property hidden, Mrs. Carradine, because it served so well as your unregistered port of call." Sylvia's fingers curled around the ledger. "Hypothetically, if what you say were true, Miss Marple, what would it matter now? The police have their murderer. The papers are silent. The scandal you fear won't come." Miss Marple's voice was almost gentle. "But it will, because you overreached. Thomas Yates discovered the shipments. You ordered Pierce to deal with him. Emily Harcourt recognized the handwriting in the manifests, your handwriting. And now, with Pierce arrested, you came tonight to destroy the last piece of evidence linking you to it all." Sylvia laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "And if I did? It's my word against a dead man's. Who would believe the testimony of a doddering spinster and a constable with nothing to show?" "Ah," Miss Marple said, "but you see, we do have something to show." She nodded toward the far corner, where a faint red light blinked in the shadows. Sylvia's head whipped around. A compact recording device sat atop the cabinet, its wire trailing to a microphone hidden in the desk lamp. Cray's voice was steady. "We've been recording since you stepped through that door. Every word you've said tonight will be played in court, including your admission that Pierce acted under your orders." Sylvia's mask slipped. The polite society smile curdled into something raw and furious. "You think you're clever," she hissed, "but you've no idea what you're meddling with. Men with real power don't care for old women's games." Miss Marple met her glare with a mild expression. "I think you'll find that even powerful men grow quite uneasy when the details of their criminal arrangements are read aloud before a jury." Sylvia's eyes darted toward the window. The rain had eased, but the grounds beyond were dark. She shifted her weight. Cray tensed. Then, in a sudden burst of movement, she swept the ledger into her arm and bolted for the door. Cray lunged after her, but Miss Marple's voice cut sharply through the study. "Not the hallway, Inspector. The terrace." Cray pivoted, sprinting for the French doors that opened onto the terrace. As Sylvia barreled down the hall toward the front entrance, she met him coming in from the side, blocking her path. She spun, looking for another escape, only to find two constables stepping through the foyer doors, rain dripping from their coats. She stopped, breath coming fast, her eyes narrowing at Miss Marple. "You planned this." Every step Miss Marple rose from her chair, her knitting bag swinging lightly from her hand. "Of course, dear. The only way to catch a predator is to let it believe it's still the hunter." Cray moved in, snapping the cuffs around Sylvia's wrists. "Sylvia Carradine, you're under arrest for conspiracy, smuggling, and the murder of Thomas Yates." As they led her out into the rain, she twisted to hurl one last look over her shoulder. "This won't end it. There are others." Miss Marple stood by the desk, watching as the night swallowed her into the waiting police car. The ledger sat where it had fallen, its pages fluttering in the draught from the open terrace doors. "Indeed," she murmured to herself, "there always are." Cray returned, water streaming from his coat. "That's it, then. She'll face the magistrate in the morning. You really had her dancing to your tune." Miss Marple smiled faintly, gathering her knitting once more. "Not my tune, Inspector. The truth's. All I did was make sure she heard it." The rain began again, a soft percussion against the glass, and somewhere deep in the house the grandfather clock chimed midnight. The game was over, the pieces were in place, and for the first time in many nights Greystone seemed to exhale. The trial of Sylvia Carradine was the talk of Greystone for weeks. Every column in the Gazette dripped with speculation, and the courthouse steps became a stage for gossips and onlookers alike. Miss Marple, however, kept a characteristically low profile, content to knit in the public gallery, while Inspector Cray laid out the case. The evidence was damning: her coded manifests, the smuggling records, and the recording from the night she tried to retrieve the ledger. The jury retired for barely 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. It seemed the case was finished. On a damp Wednesday morning, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It bore no return address, only her name written in a firm, deliberate hand. She opened it over tea, the steam curling upward as she unfolded the single sheet. "You've stopped the wrong person." No signature. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Such notes were hardly unusual in her line of quiet work, but there was something about the confidence of the handwriting, the certainty of the statement, that made her set aside her tea untasted. She took the note straight to Inspector Cray. "This is some crank's attempt to unsettle you," he said after reading it. "Sylvia's behind bars and the rest of the ring's scattered. It's over." Miss Marple's needles clicked in her lap. "It's a tempting thought, Inspector, but something about that letter bothers me. Whoever wrote it knew where to find me, and chose not to threaten, merely to correct." Cray sighed. "You're saying they want us to believe they're the real mastermind?" "Not believe, perhaps," she said, "but suspect, which is altogether more dangerous." That afternoon she paid a call to Emily Harcourt, widow of the late smuggler Pierce. Emily had been living quietly in the modest Whitby cottage left to her, avoiding the trial's public glare. Emily welcomed her in, making tea while Miss Marple's gaze wandered the sitting-room. On the mantel sat a photograph of Pierce, younger and smiling, with his arm around a man Miss Marple didn't recognise. The face was narrow, the expression guarded. "That was taken in Devon," Emily said from the kitchen. "Pierce and his cousin Leonard, before they had their falling out." "Falling out?" Emily shrugged. "Family nonsense. Leonard always thought Pierce owed him a share of something. An inheritance, he said. But Pierce claimed Leonard was nothing but trouble." Miss Marple's mind ticked quietly. Back in her cottage that evening, she took out the note again, comparing the handwriting to a dozen samples she kept from the case, the manifests, Pierce's old shipping notes, and Sylvia's trial statements. The letter matched none of them, but there was a faint similarity to the ledger's annotations, those small margin notes that had never been traced. At the time, Cray assumed they were Pierce's, but Miss Marple had doubted it. If Leonard had been involved, it would explain a great deal. The smuggling's longevity, the sophistication of the shipping routes, the fact that Sylvia had always seemed to be fronting something larger. She decided not to sleep on it. By the next morning, she and Cray were walking the fog-dampened pier in Whitby, following the directions Emily had given them to Leonard's fishing boat. It was there they found him, thin, weathered, and quietly mending nets in the stern. He looked up without surprise. "I thought you'd come sooner," he said, voice low. Cray stepped forward. "Leonard Harcourt, I've a few questions about your cousin Pierce and a certain smuggling operation." Leonard's mouth twitched. Pierce was a fool. Got himself mixed up with the Caradine woman. She was useful, sure, but she didn't have the stomach for it. Too proud. You take out people like her, the rest keep working. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Which is why you wrote to me. You wanted me to know the game wasn't over." His gaze met hers. "I wanted you to know you'd been played. Sylvia thought she was running things, but she was just keeping the authorities busy. The real routes, the real cargo, that's mine. Still is." Cray's jaw tightened. "That's a confession." Leonard's smile was cold. "To what? Talking to an old lady on the pier? No recordings, no evidence, no witnesses who'll speak against me. You've got nothing." Miss Marple's knitting bag swung lightly in her hand. "Perhaps. But then I thought it curious you'd choose to mend nets here, at this hour. The tide's coming in, and with it, a certain trawler from Calais that's been under customs surveillance for weeks." Leonard froze. Cray straightened. "You've just linked yourself to that trawler, Mr. Harcourt." The sound of boots on wood announced the arrival of 2 plainclothes officers from the harbour patrol. Leonard's eyes flicked to the water, then back to Miss Marple, who regarded him mildly. "You've been clever, Mr. Harcourt," she said softly, "but cleverness is no match for arrogance. It makes people show themselves at the most inconvenient moments." Leonard was taken without resistance, but his look as he was led away was almost one of respect. Later, in Cray's office, the inspector leaned back in his chair. "If that letter hadn't come, he'd still be out there. You think he sent it because he wanted to be caught?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not exactly. Men like Leonard can't resist proving they're the smartest person in the room. But that pride, well, it's rather like a loose thread in a sweater. Tug on it, and the whole thing unravels." She rose, collecting her knitting bag. "Now, Inspector, I believe the case is truly over. Until, of course, the next one decides to drop itself in our laps." Cray chuckled. "And you'll be ready?" "Always." Outside, the gulls wheeled over the harbour, and the tide rolled in as it always had, indifferent to the small dramas of men and women, yet somehow carrying them inexorably toward their end. The Caradine trial was history, Leonard Harcourt's arrest the new headline, and yet the air in Greystone felt thick, as if the town were holding its breath. In Inspector Cray's office, files lay stacked like miniature towers, each one bristling with witness statements, photographs, and customs reports from the past 3 months. Leonard sat in a holding cell downstairs awaiting formal charges. The harbour trawler had yielded crates of unmarked cargo, silks, antiques, and a surprising amount of contraband spirits. On paper, it was an open and shut case, but Miss Marple knew better. "Leonard's far too composed," she told Cray over tea. "Even men who pride themselves on stoicism betray themselves when cornered. His calm suggests that he doesn't believe he's cornered at all." Cray frowned. "You think he's got an escape route planned?" "Oh, I'm sure of it. The question is whether it's physical or legal." 2 days later, her suspicion was confirmed. Leonard's solicitor arrived with a petition for immediate release, claiming the trawler's cargo was part of a legitimate import arrangement, one that Sylvia Caradine had fraudulently registered under her name. With her convicted and unable to defend herself, Leonard positioned himself as a victim of her schemes. Customs officials admitted their surveillance had been focused more on Sylvia's network than Leonard himself. Most of the paperwork for the cargo was, infuriatingly, in order. Cray slammed his fist on his desk. If this goes through, he walks. And without the trawler, we've got nothing tying him to the smuggling long term. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Then we shall have to tie him to it ourselves. That evening she sat at her kitchen table, spreading out her private archive of case notes. Patterns emerged, routes, dates, and an odd habit. Every shipment Leonard had managed passed through one of 3 small harbours in Devon, always in late spring or early autumn. There had been an odd entry, too, in Pierce's old ledger. Harcourt's special, 2 for 1, only in bloom. At the time, it had seemed like some smuggler's slang for a discount, but as she recalled, Leonard had kept a small greenhouse behind his Devon property, known for cultivating rare orchids. If the orchids were his personal mark, hidden in legitimate cargo, then all she needed was to prove one of those flowers had travelled in the smuggled crates. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the customs warehouse, where the confiscated goods from the trawler were kept. She moved carefully among the crates, nodding politely to the officers on duty, until she found what she was looking for. A small wooden box, air-holed and lined with damp moss. Inside was a single pale orchid, its petals like ivory silk, roots still moist. "Rare?" she asked the customs clerk. "Extremely," he said. "This species can't be imported without special license. Needs very particular growing conditions." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And very particular hands, I imagine." Armed with that, she returned to Cray. "Find out if Leonard has a license for importing orchids. If not, he's just smuggled one right under our noses, documented, catalogued, and in the custody of your department." It took less than an hour for the answer to come back. Leonard had no such license. By that afternoon, Cray was back in Leonard's cell, holding the orchid's shipping manifest. "Funny thing, Harcourt. This here says you imported this without a license. That's smuggling, plain and simple." Leonard's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before his smirk returned. "One flower? That's your grand charge?" Miss Marple stepped into view. "It's the thread, Mr. Harcourt. Tug it, and we find the whole sweater." Cray laid down the new evidence. Photographs of similar orchids found in earlier seizures, each one linked to harbours Leonard had frequented. One was even traced to a shipment from the year Pierce was still alive, long before Sylvia entered the picture. In court, the orchids became the nail in Leonard's coffin. They tied him to years of smuggling activity, revealed a personal signature he could not plausibly deny, and dismantled the defence that Sylvia had been the sole operator. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, there was no flicker of shock on Leonard's face, only a faint nod, as if acknowledging the only opponent who had truly beaten him. Later, over tea in the quiet of her cottage, Cray asked the question that had been bothering him. "How did you even know to look for the orchids?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Do you recall that first visit to Emily Harcourt's home, the photograph of Leonard and Pierce? There was a vase in the background holding a single orchid. Out of place for a Devon fisherman's parlour, wouldn't you say? That told me Leonard valued them, not for their beauty, but as something rare and controllable. Smugglers, you see, are often like collectors. They leave their fingerprints not in ink, but in habits." Cray shook his head. "You had that in mind the whole time, didn't you?" "Not the whole time," she said, sipping her tea. "Just from the moment I realised Leonard had written in Pierce's ledger. That little phrase about only in bloom. Why, that was practically an invitation." As summer settled over Greystone, both Sylvia and Leonard awaited long sentences, their empire dismantled. The harbour was quieter now, its gulls screaming over honest cargo, but Miss Marple knew the sea had a long memory. Smuggling had a way of washing back ashore years later, in some new form. For now, though, justice, imperfect and human as it always was, had been served, and somewhere in the back of her mind a part of her was already listening for the next loose thread. The trial was over, the press had gone home, and the Harcourt affair was already slipping into the realm of gossip and half-remembered headlines. The seaside air felt lighter, almost celebratory, though the gulls screamed with the same piercing insistence as before. Inspector Cray stood with Miss Marple on the pier, watching a small fishing boat tug into harbour. The water was calm for once, a mirror broken only by the occasional flash of silver as a mackerel leapt. "You've done the town a service," Cray said, adjusting his hat against the glare. "Both of them gone, the rest of the network scattered. I suppose we can breathe easier now." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm not sure ease is the right word. Cases like this don't so much end as change shape." They walked together toward the edge of the pier, where the old boards creaked beneath their feet. Cray spoke of paperwork and customs reforms, of how he meant to keep the smaller harbours under tighter watch. Miss Marple listened politely, but her eyes were drawn to a coiled rope lying by a mooring post. It was knotted in a peculiar way, not the standard bowline used by the local fishermen, but a more intricate weave, like a herringbone pattern. She had seen it once before, months ago. In a photograph found in Leonard Harcourt's personal effects, tucked behind a newspaper clipping. The image had seemed unimportant then, a man's hands tying that exact knot, the face hidden in shadow. That photograph had never come up in court. It hadn't fit anywhere in the Harcourt puzzle. But now, here it was again, lying innocently on the pier as if it had been waiting for her. "Something wrong?" Cray asked. "Nothing at all," she said lightly, stepping over the rope. "Only, it's curious what the tide chooses to bring in." The next morning she found an envelope pushed through her letterbox. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The message read, "Some debts aren't paid in court, some are collected elsewhere." Beneath the words was a faint watermark, a ship's crest she didn't recognize. Miss Marple turned the paper over, examining the grain of the ink. Whoever had written it had used a fountain pen, not a typewriter, and the handwriting, though blocky, bore a certain elegance, precisely measured strokes, as if the writer had been trained to disguise their style, yet couldn't help a trace of personality slipping through. She didn't tell Cray about the letter. Not yet. He deserved his victory without the shadow of another storm forming on the horizon. Instead, she took her tea in the garden, letting the roses nod in the breeze, and thought about that knot on the pier, the hidden photograph, and now this letter. 3 threads, each too fine to tug at alone, but together. They hinted at something larger, older, and unfinished. Her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd overheard in the Greystone Inn, weeks before Leonard's arrest. 2 sailors, voices low but urgent, discussing the manifest that never made it ashore. She had thought it idle talk then. Now, she wasn't so sure. Late that afternoon, she visited the Maritime Registry in Plymouth. She spent hours thumbing through dusty ledgers, her gloved fingers tracing ship names and cargo lists. And then she saw it, the crest from the letter, the Marlin Grace. Officially, the vessel had been decommissioned 5 years ago after structural damages, but its port entries suggested otherwise. Twice in the past year, it had been sighted near Greystone waters, though never docking officially, always just passing through. She closed the ledger softly. If the Marlin Grace was still active, it meant someone was using it to bypass all the new security measures Cray was so proud of. Back in her cottage, she took the photograph from her desk drawer, the hidden hands tying that peculiar knot. She placed it beside the letter and the copied crest from the registry. The hands belonged to someone who had learned knots not from fishing, but from sailing in open waters. A smuggler's knot, not a harbourman's. And the letter's tone was personal, as if written by someone with a stake in the Harcourt affair. Perhaps Leonard wasn't the last player standing. Perhaps he'd merely been the most visible. That night, the wind rose. Over Greystone, rattling the window panes. Somewhere far out at sea, a horn sounded, a long, low note that faded into the darkness. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper. She made 3 careful notes. 1. Marlin Grace, last seen off Greystone, midnight tide 2. Not identical to Harcourt photograph 3. Letter, threat, or warning. She underlined the 3rd twice. The next morning, the post brought nothing unusual, and the town went about its business. Children played on the beach. Fishermen hauled in nets heavy with herring. Greystone, at least on the surface, seemed whole again. But as Miss Marple walked along the cliff path, the horizon seemed different to her now, not peaceful, but watchful. She paused, gazing out toward the open water. Somewhere beyond that faint line where sea met sky, the Marlin Grace might be waiting, its crew tying those intricate knots, its hold filled with cargo not listed in any registry. She didn't know when the tide would turn again, but she was certain it would. When she finally returned home, she placed the letter and photograph in a separate envelope, sealed it, and tucked it into the false bottom of her desk drawer. It was not evidence, not yet, merely a reminder. Some cases ended with a trial, a sentence and a neat summing up. Others lingered like the smell of salt in the air, never gone, only carried elsewhere by the wind. And as the evening light turned the sea to molten gold, Miss Marple thought, not with dread, but with quiet resolve, a mystery never truly ends. It simply waits for the right eyes to notice it again.